Welcome, geography students. Today we are going to be talking about development in terms of the quality of life in a particular area of the world. Development tends to be categorized into a couple of different areas, such as economic, factors, as well as social, or dealing with the people on a personal level, as well as more population and health care related statistics. Today we're going to take a look at the economic factors that go into development. And overall, you should just know first that development refers to not only the quality of life, but the level of achievement, you might say, for a particular country. So one thing that might help you to understand what we're looking at in terms of development is comparing different countries. Why is it that some countries are so well off and have a lot of resources, have great quality of life and other factors, but others do not? And how do we compare the quality of lives and the overall development, how advanced a society or particular country is what we're looking at. And so, again, one of the things that we look at in terms of quantifying that is their economic statistics, right? So things that show us that this country is more or less developed, right? So the first thing we need to know is, what is development? So we already talked about this a little bit, but it's measuring the quality of life, the standard of living, and how basically how nice is it in this particular country. Is it a nice place to live? Is it difficult place to live and to raise a family, and those types of things. And one of the ways in which we quantify and rank different countries is something called the Human Development Index. And it ranks basically the quality of life in different countries and uses a scale using different statistics. So basically, we're going to learn about a lot of statistics that help measure human development. However, this particular statistic is very useful in that it takes into account all of the different statistics, both economic and social, together into a comprehensive formula that gives us a numerical value or rating from 0 to 1. 1 being, highest possible quality of life, 0 being the lowest quality possible, quality of life. And then it additionally gives us an ability to compare countries and rank them, in their different versions. And you can see here, a couple of examples, like for instance, Argentina, their rating is 0.827, right? Closer to 1 than say Ethiopia is 0.448. And that tells us that Argentina has, a much better, in terms of quality of life and the standard of living in that country versus Ethiopia, which is in sub-Saharan Africa, a more, a poorer area, as you guys have learned over the course of this class. And so that would make sense that they have a lower HDI and ranking in Ethiopia versus Argentina. And so this map in the bottom right corner also gives us an idea of different pockets of higher and lower quality of life. So you can see areas like the U.S. and Canada and North America have a relatively high HDI. Western Europe, to a degree, Eastern Europe, as well as Oceania. You got Australia, New Zealand, and then a couple other pockets such as South Korea, Japan, have very high HDIs. Whereas sub-Saharan Africa, right, in this region here, has the lowest HDI of any region, as well as places in the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia have relatively low HDIs, for various different reasons that we're going to look at. All right, but it should be noted that in general, countries around the world are moving up and up and up on the HDI scale as technology increases and innovations and other advances in medicine reach these lesser developed countries. It's allowing them to have a higher quality of life and thus improving their HDI as well along the way. All right, so let's take a look, for instance, at some of the economic statistics that they use. All right, the first one, in terms of Determining the standard of living in a particular country we look at is called the gross domestic product. And you've probably heard this at some form or another, but it's called the GDP. Most often we look at the GDP PPP, which means purchase power parity, which you don't need to know for our class, but essentially it allows us to compare countries in terms of their total output. So think of the economy, think of all the jobs, all the things being produced in a given year. So think of all the different cars and phones and services and goods and things like that each individual person produces. You add all of those up, right? Put all of them in a big pile, add up their numerical dollar value in a given year for a particular country, and that is its GDP. So more productive countries are going to have higher GDPs. Additionally, countries with higher populations are going to have a higher GDP as well because there's more people that are producing these different goods and services. Additionally, the more technology that you have contributes to your GDP as well. How efficient you are, right? So if you have automated machinery that are making things in large factories, that's going to allow you to produce more and more goods, and therefore, you're able to have a higher GDP as a result. So your economy is more productive as compared to another country that doesn't have technology or machines. They have to do it all by hand, and so they're not going to be as efficient. They're not going to be able to make as many goods, and so they're going to have a lower GDP. Okay, so productivity is a huge part of GDP. For comparison, the U.S. has 18.5 trillion, which is a crazy number to even try to imagine. $1 trillion GDP on a given year. And the only country that's larger, has a larger GDP, is China. And while the U.S. is much more productive, like on a per capita basis, like per person, China has so many people, as we learned in a previous unit, over 1.2 billion people in China, that they're able to have an even larger economy because of that. So the number of people plus how productive you are, indicates your GDP. But a better indicator of the overall quality of life in a particular country is by taking into account the number of people in the country, right? So on average, how much does the individual person in the country produce? And that'll give you a better picture of the quality of life. So we use that by using GDP per capita, right? So we take that total GDP, that $18.5 trillion, divide it by our population. In America, it's over 300 million people. I think around 350 million people was the latest numbers I saw. And you get a number around $55,000. So an individual person, the average person in the U.S., produces roughly $55,000 worth of goods or services in a given year, right? Compare that to China, because they have a much larger population. You're dividing 21.5 trillion by 1.2 billion people instead of 350 million in the U.S. And so that means that, on average, the individual Chinese worker is going to be much less productive than the U.S. And one of the big reasons why is what the U.S. produces, as well as the technology and other factors, advancements that we have in our economy that allows us to produce so much. And to give you even, a lower comparison is South Sudan and Sub-Saharan Africa. They only produce $23 billion worth of goods and services each year. And so per capita, it's less than $2,000 per person being produced in the population. So that tells us that in South Sudan, the quality of life is very low as compared to even China. And then, of course, most developed countries like the U.S., Western Europe, Australia, et cetera. All right, so this gives you a general picture, because one of the things that you should see is that GDP and the economy have a direct effect on the things that you can purchase in a society, the quality of goods and services you can receive in terms of medical care. The more money you have, as you might imagine, tends to lead to a higher quality of life, right? So there is a direct correlation there. So countries that are wealthier are going to have a higher quality of life and thus a higher HDI ranking, and they're going to be more developed. Countries with lower economic outputs, lower wages, higher poverty rates are going to end up having lower development rates. Okay, so we can see a lot of that here in those examples. All right, so here's a good example here of a map that shows us the GDP per capita. So taking into account population. The U.S., Western Europe, Oceania, right? So this is correlated to that first map I showed you with HDI, right? The economy is one of the largest factors in determining the quality of life. However, as we've learned, already, there's more to it than just the economy. In a later video, we'll take into account more social factors, things like the quality of men and women in the country, the freedoms that you enjoy, healthcare. There's all kinds of other factors that lead to a better quality of life, not just how much money you have. All right. So HDI takes into account not only money like GDP, but those other social factors as well. All right. So a couple other economic indicators you should be familiar with is the percent of the labor force by sector. We talked about this last unit, right? Remember, there's primary, secondary, tertiary. So we have like agriculture in terms of primary, manufacturing, factory work, those types of jobs in the secondary sector. And tertiary are going to be your higher level service-based jobs. The general trend is that most LDCs or lesser developed countries are going to have more people working in agriculture. Think about subsistence farming or very basic farming practices in order to make a living. Right, and then as societies develop, they have less people needed in the agriculture sector, and they can work in factories and in service jobs like they can work to become doctors or teachers or lawyers and things like that, as well as other service jobs as well. This allows for higher overall economic output, and so the general trend is that if you look at a country's primary, secondary, tertiary rate, your most developed countries like the U.S. is going to have like 85 to 90% of the population working in the tertiary sector or like service-based jobs. A significant percent of the population working in the secondary sector, but relatively low, and then very few, like 1%. Or they're around working in the primary sector or extracting natural resources. Because of technology, there's less need for people working those jobs. It allows them to work other jobs instead, right? But in lesser developed countries, they don't have the technology, so they need a lot more people working in the primary sector, filling those basic needs before we can move on to some of the more high-paying or more advanced jobs, you might say. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution had pushed us from the primary sector to the secondary and now to the tertiary is where most countries are that are more developed, at least today. We can also look at the poverty rate, right? So if, in a poorer country, they're going to have a large percent of the population that are below the global poverty rate, or the amount of money needed to, as set by the UN, needed to survive or to live comfortably. Comfortably is very relative. But how much money do you make? And if that's below the global poverty line, then you're considered impoverished, right? So in poverty, if a country has a large percent of their population below that poverty line, that's a good indicator that they are, either a lesser developed country or they're not taking care of their poor. And so that's a lower quality of life, and that gets them a lower rating on the HDI scale. So you can be a wealthy country and have a high poverty rate because it's just a portion of your population that has all the wealth and privileges, and therefore that would lower your overall quality of life in the country, right? Because those people below the poverty line are suffering. Okay. Additionally, raw materials is a big indicator. Countries with more raw materials, like say the U.S., which is a large country, there's all kinds of natural resources, things that we don't have to import from other countries. That allows their economy to grow and allows our businesses and industries to grow as well. If you have to import things from other countries, it ends up costing more money and it hurts your overall economy because you're spending more money to try to make more money. And so the larger country you have and the more raw materials, things like oil or other factors that you can have, the better off you'll be. And then finally, consumer goods, right? So this is what you think of when you go to Walmart, right? What's the access to consumer goods? In America, it's very high, right? The highest in the world, most likely. You go down the road a couple minutes and you're going to find a store full of all these types of items, right? Things that make your life easier, right? That without them, it would make your life more difficult, right? Imagine a world without, all the different things that are in the grocery store and you had to grow your own food. right? Or imagine a world where you didn't have toilet paper on the every corner in every convenience store, and you had to find some other way of making ends meet there. But so that's another good indicator that the quality of life in a country is relatively high by how easily accessible and how expensive are these consumer goods, right? As compared to, like, can the average person afford to buy these types of consumer goods, or is it kind of a luxury that most people can't afford? So not only access to, but also the ability to buy, right, as a small percentage of your budget, these consumer goods. All right. So uh, you know, these types of factors, as well as others, give us a good indicator of the quality of life in a country based on their economic stats.